All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to the webinar, and that you will hopefully learn some new things about student data privacy. And like I was saying, as we were kind of waiting for everyone to trickle in, student data privacy is a lot more interesting, I think, than you might think it is. So right here, I do have the bit.ly, which I've also put into the chat. And so you can have access to this slideshow. There's a bunch of resources that I've linked. So pretty much all of this information I've linked at the end in a couple of slides, so you can have access to that as well. So this is me. I'm the Director of Technology and Information Services up in Wheeling, School District 21. We're a K-8 district. We have about a little less than 6,000 students. That's me on Twitter at Alicia Duell. And again, there's the link to the bit.ly. So you might be wondering, why did I get started in becoming interested in student data privacy? It's not anything that I sort of naturally assumed I would become interested in, but as you know, a lot of times our jobs, realities of our jobs, responsibilities that fall to us, sometimes light our path, I guess. And so for me, ever since I've been in the district, which is about, oh, it doesn't have permission error. I'm sorry, I will fix that. Thank you, John. So the district, for the last 5 years since I've been in the district, I've been kind of the default district app / website vetter with no formal training or no, any like special knowledge about that. It was more like I would read the terms of service, read the privacy policy, and then, hope that that was enough and that that was okay. So this might sound familiar to some of you because somebody's got to vet these apps and websites. And unless you're like legally trained, a lot of times you don't really know for sure what you're looking for. So that was the first way that I got thinking about data privacy. And then, as most of you probably know, in July, Illinois had a new state law go into effect called SOPA, which we will talk a little bit about in a minute. And so I became the SOPA person. So all summer, that was the big project, was basically getting data privacy agreements with all of the different ed tech vendors. And so that really gave me an introduction into data privacy. And then also all of the media stories that we see currently, just all of the different things that data breaches, leaks, hacks, all of the things. So it just has become very relevant and timely. So I just completed a 9-month program called the Train the Trainer program, which was put on by Student Privacy Compass and the Future of Privacy Forum. So like I said, it's a 9-month program, and it really went deeply into data privacy in schools. All right, so today's agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about why does it matter? Why does data privacy matter? We'll talk about what student data and student data privacy means, kind of like definitionally. We'll talk about some relevant student data privacy laws that you need to know, and then a few that are just nice to know. Talk about some student data privacy in the news, ethics and equity concerns. And then we're going to do a really fun, interesting scenarios activity. Well, we'll throw out a few different scenarios, and then you can like think about them, and we'll kind of have a little discussion in the chat. Talk about what you, regardless of what your role is at school or district, what you can do to advocate for increased student data privacy. All right, so first of all, why student data privacy matters? What are the risks? So there's 3 main categories of harm that can come to students if student data privacy is not managed effectively. So first of all, students can have actual harm come to them. So if information is revealed, it's possible that students could come to physical, emotional, or reputational harm. So if you think about some of the data that we have about students, if that got into the wrong hands, students could be actually harmed in these ways. Definitely legal consequences. We as school authorities, districts might face fines, lawsuit, potentially even imprisonment, and definitely really, really negative media coverage, which is the PR disaster. Also commercialization, and so a lot of what SOPA and other laws are trying to do is to prevent students from having profiles created on them so that they can be commercialized. Equity concerns, so potentially sharing data in ways that might have equity implications, social harm by stigmatization and bullying based on certain kinds of information that people might find out, and then over surveillance. So this is something that we'll talk a little bit more about in a little bit later in the presentation, thinking about over monitoring and over collecting data and the effects that that can have on students as well. Permanent record. So record of students' mistakes, again, that's collected by school districts, might go on to harm them in their future opportunities, loss of opportunity in the job market, or potentially further education that they might be pursuing. Students might be accessing inappropriate content, and then also just potential safety concerns. All right, so let's just start with some definitions: student data and privacy. So when you start learning about student data privacy, you'll hear PII, personally identifiable information, all the time. And so for this graphic here, it's really busy, but just focus on the left side of this graphic. So what I liked about it is it breaks down the types of data that is generated and collected by schools about students, okay? So first of all, we've got data that's generated by teachers. So it could be observational written data, or even like numeric indicators about observational data on engagement. Data that is generated by students, such as homework that's collected online, learning apps, things like that. Demographics, so any of your student information systems and many other apps and sites that we use in education collects information about economic status, special needs, demographics, race, gender, all of that stuff. Action, so stuff that students do is all collected, student data. So their attendance, their behavior, any groups that they're a part of. Testing, of course, tons and tons of assessment information and academic information. So their grades, their growth, their enrollment, all of that stuff. That's a lot of information that we collect about students. And so if you think about it, all of that data that we've just looked at, it's all stored in online platforms. It's not stored under lock and key in a filing cabinet anymore. It's all online. And so when we think about that kind of precious data, and if the system of data privacy isn't kind of followed appropriately and safeguarded appropriately, there's a lot of information about students that could just get released. Excuse me. So this, I don't expect you to be able to read this all closely, but this is an example of Embrace IEPs, which I think probably many of us use. It's their data privacy agreement for Illinois. And so part of a data privacy agreement has this Exhibit B. So Exhibit B is where vendors have to X all of the data that they collect. And so some platforms don't have many things collected. They just don't collect that much stuff. But obviously Embrace IEP, because of what it is, it collects probably the most of any kind of data that I've seen. So it collects assessment, attendance, demographics, special needs, any kind of economic information, transportation information, like everything. And so if you think about who all has access to Embrace IEP, how is that decided, and how are we making sure that this information is protected? That's a lot of sensitive data. So data privacy has been defined as a fundamental right by the US Constitution, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and many countries around the world. It really talks about control over how data is used and how it's shared. It's also subjective. So everybody has different expectations and understandings of data privacy. So I bet that of those of us 46 people in this webinar, we all would have slightly different expectations and interpretations of how we want our data to be used. You know, if you think about the discussion about Apple and Google and facial recognition software, vaccine collecting information, like we all have different feelings about that. And so that's just kind of the nature of data privacy. It's also contextual. So data privacy understandings and opinions evolves throughout time. And so if we think back like maybe 50 years ago, maybe people wouldn't think twice about sharing a certain kind of data, like a social security number. Maybe it was like, you know, I'll just put it on this form, it's fine. But now we know that is something that you safeguard with your life because of all of the, you know, identity theft and all of that. So that kind of data privacy concerns and expectations evolves over time. So it's not like a static thing. Student data privacy then, and this is defined by Student Privacy Compass. It refers to the responsible, ethical, and equitable collection, use, sharing, and protection of student data. And so this is just another graphic that I think really nicely lays out the different kinds of data issues or problems that can arise. And many of them really do impact how we might interact with data at the education level. So there's 4 different types of kind of during the life of data when something could go wrong. So first of all, you've got during the information processing stage, what could go wrong? During the information collection stage, what could go wrong? The dissemination stage, and then the invasion stage, which is something that I would say we don't really see or have to think about too much in education. But if we think about information processing, so this is once we have the data, the information, what happens to it? So one problem could be if you've got a bunch of different students' personal information that separately doesn't really mean too much, but you put it all together, that could be too much information that somebody from the outside can get and then aggregate together to identify a student. Of course, insecurity. So this is like, we're not taking really good care of our privacy, our passwords, our authentication, things like that. Identification. So this is where, again, data could be shared and then somebody could use data to then, what was supposed to be anonymous, connect it to an individual. Secondary use, this is something that we really talk a lot about with SOPA and other data privacy laws. We don't want students' information to be collected so that companies can make like a profile to try to sell students things. And then exclusion. And so this is part of SOPA too. We have to let parents know what data is being collected about their child and which vendors are collecting it. And so that's part of the SOPA law. And then information dissemination. So that's like when you're sharing information inappropriately. So you've got breach of confidentiality. So of course, if we're like talking about stuff we know about a student, even to another teacher, if that teacher doesn't have any direct professional interest in that student, that's a breach of confidentiality. Obviously sharing something on social media, but even like kind of sharing just info about students that with somebody who doesn't have direct interest, that's a breach of confidentiality. Disclosure and anything about maybe a student that might affect their security or might cause prejudice or bullying against that student. Exposure, probably not as big of a concern. Increased accessibility though. So this is like some of the true life examples I'm going to share with you in a minute. That's increased accessibility. We're like, whoops, all of a sudden we didn't mean to, but we've just put out all of this information that we should have either redacted or should never have shared in the first place. The last 3, probably not something we're going to see in education. Again, like I said, invasion, not so much in education, but information collection. This is something that I think we are right now at this moment, 2020, 2022, something that we need to think about. Surveillance, how we are monitoring students, and then also interrogation, the kinds of information, personal information that we're asking students for. And we'll talk more a little bit about that in a minute. So student data privacy laws. These are the big five, I would say. The bottom two below the line, there's really nothing that you can do about these. Think about right here, this is the Children's Internet Protection Act. It's about 20 years old. This is what your CTO, Information Services Director, would do. And that just says you have to basically have filtering software in order to get E-rate money. So, and everybody does that nowadays. So that's one that you really don't have to think about too much. COPA, Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. You don't have to think about this because this is actually on the vendors, on ed tech vendors and websites. They just can't collect personal and the PII from children under 13 without parental consent. So you don't have to worry about that. These top three though, these are the ones that ideally you have some sense of. This top one, FERPA, number one, if you forget everything that we talked about in this webinar, try to remember FERPA because it's the most important. So if we look at PPRA down here at the bottom, this is an old law, it's from 1978. So this protects students from having to reveal personal information on surveys without parental consent. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but I think this is really relevant now because I think with the pandemic, a lot of teachers are concerned about their students. And so we though have to be careful as teachers not to just like make a survey and ask students like questions that might be problematic that we're not allowed to actually ask without parental consent. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later too, but just that's something, and also as building leaders, so the principals in the room, if you know of teachers who are trying to administer like kind of homemade surveys to students, that might be something that you just kind of give a little warning about. Like there's some ways you can avoid that. You can do like emojis, how are you feeling, that kind of thing. Or, there's ways that you can kind of get in a temperature check, but you really can't ask questions about these 8 protected topics because that could get you into legal problems. And then SOPA, the middle one here. So this is the one that's brand new. This is the Student Online Personal Protection Act. So this was really this came about from parental pressure, parental interest, and wanting to know, hey, what data are you people collecting at the educational level? And how are you safeguarding my children's data? And so this requires districts to have these data privacy agreements signed with every vendor that collects student data. It also requires that we, the school district, post publicly a list of all of those vendors and also what information, what data those vendors collect. And so this was a major task for probably many of you in this webinar, but over the summer. And so even though it was a real pain to do, because it took a lot of time and effort, I personally feel like it was a very good thing because it helped all of us, I think, in Illinois to understand what are we talking about? What kinds of things do we need to make sure vendors are and aren't doing? And I think vendors probably didn't love this law because it really made them promise and kind of make some agreements that maybe they didn't want to make or they weren't ready to make. So I think all in all, it's been a really, really good thing. And so if you might not have much to do with this, if you're a teacher or somebody who's not like directly involved in maintaining this information on your school website, but if you're a teacher or somebody who works directly with students, building principal, et cetera, you do need to make sure that you can confirm that you and your teachers are not using any websites or apps with students that haven't been vetted by your district and that don't have a data privacy agreement. So that's really, really important. If you're like, not really sure about that one, contact your tech department and they can, help you understand and confirm that you are protecting student data privacy. And then the number one, if you don't remember anything else, FERPA. So this is also an older one. It's the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. So this gives parents rights regarding their children's records. And as we know, records are things, anything basically that's an official document, you know, the grade book, anything written, official, that kind of thing, behavioral records, anything like that. Now, so it gives parents the right to review those records, to correct those records if necessary. And then the big one is that parents have the right to give permission to share those records. So that sounds really problematic from a school district perspective. Like, we have so many people that need so many different kinds of records that if we had to ask the parent every time we needed to share, you know, a student record with somebody, nothing would ever get done. So there is an exception. The exception is school officials with legitimate educational interest. That's the main exception. The exception also is for like PTA directory information, certain studies. But the big exception that you want to remember is if you're a school official with a legitimate educational interest, you do not have to have permission from the parents. And so that's why I was saying, if you have information about a child as the teacher, you can share something about that child's record with a principal or with another teacher who works with that child, anybody who has a legitimate professional educational interest, not your teammate down the hall, but somebody who has a legitimate educational interest in that child. And this also goes for, we can have school ed tech vendors. We can classify those companies and platforms as having legitimate educational interest. And so that's how we're able to share student data with some of these educational platforms, because these apps, websites, et cetera, are essentially doing work that we in the district would do, but we're kind of allowing this other company or app to do it for us, if that makes sense. So that's the big FERPA, really, really important to kind of have an understanding of that one. So I'm going to skip this video because we tested it earlier and the volume was too low, but if you're interested in kind of watching some really humorous videos, short videos about student data privacy, like all different kinds of things, the Utah Board of Education has a hilarious YouTube series. So it's like a playlist. Again, Utah Board of Education, who knew, but really, really funny short videos explaining, yeah, Chris says Utah has some great videos. And so this video talks about those exceptions. And one really good thing to know is that even though SOPA makes us list all of the vendors that we share data with and all of the data that we share from each vendor, we do have to post that publicly. Parents do not have the right to request exemption or that their students do not participate in any one of those platforms. And so that is something that's really important to know, that just because you're providing transparency doesn't mean parents can selectively opt out to things that you as the district have identified as being educationally important. All right, so next thing, student data privacy in the news. There's some crazy stuff out there. So this one here in the top left, this was North Carolina. Wake schools sent postcards containing social security numbers. So they sent out postcards to, I don't remember the number, at least several hundred, if not more, homes, basically saying, do you want your child to still be in this school? Yes or no? Just kind of like let's just confirm enrollment. There was human error involved and somebody checked a box or did something, and all of those postcards were sent out with the student's social security number printed on the postcard. So that was a really, really big, human fail that caused North Carolina Wake schools a lot of headache. This one, this DC accidentally uploads private data of 12,000 students. So what happened with this is there was like a DC public schools training for people that do IEPs, like social or student services, special education, people that were going to be learning how to do IEPs. And there was like a training manual. And instead of uploading and redacting student names and student personally identifiable information, that PII, they didn't. And so all of the students, 12,000 students, full special education IEP information was publicly accessible. 12,000 students, publicly accessible IEP information. This Pearson hack, you might remember that one from just a few years ago. So there was a hack on Pearson's products. And as you know, Pearson is all over the place. It was actually their Ames Web product. So any district that had Ames Web, that information got hacked. And so thousands of students across the United States had their personal information hacked from Pearson. Maze ransomware attackers leaked data stolen from suburban Washington schools. So, some of this is hackers, ransomware, but some of it is human error. And so there's kind of like both things going on. So it's important to kind of have your protection against people from the outside, but also training and protection against people from the inside who, make mistakes, but those mistakes can be really costly. All right, this one you might remember also. So this was Rockford. And I'm just going to play this. This is a short one.
Rockford Public Schools releases its...
I don't think I pressed share video. Oh, no, I did, I think.
Ransomware saga play-by-play. RPS 205 Executive Director of Technology Jason Barthel released the details. The attack was launched on September 5th. Millions of district files were encrypted. Each had a ransom note inside. In the 2 months since the attack, RPS has rebuilt its system from the ground up. More than 6,500 devices have been brought back online. RPS doesn't believe any student or staff personal information was compromised. No word on how much the attack will cost the district, but administrators say insurance will cover some of the expense. You can read the complete post from RPS on mystateline.com.
So that was one close to home. And that's, I think, just an example of how virulent these attacks are and how common they are. And so it is really important, regardless of your role in schools, to do whatever we can to help prevent this kind of attack. And I think I saw a number that it was millions and millions of dollars that it cost Rockford. So 2020 was a record-breaking year in the US for school hacks and security failures. So the pandemic increased these incidences because if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. More people were using more technology. Also, device and account privileges increased as people went remote. So I think sometimes when we're all in person, it's easier to have things be a little bit more locked down. But when everybody went remote, office workers, admins, everybody was remote, I think a lot of previously more locked down security features got loosened up just in the interest of trying to make this work and trying to make things flow a little bit better and easier. And so some security measures might have been relaxed just to try to cope with this new reality of the pandemic. So results have been school closures, stolen taxpayer funds, identity theft, credit fraud. So these are all of the big scary things that can happen. And then this is just a graph that I thought was interesting of the different kinds of cybersecurity incident types. So this in yellow, data breach or leak. And so this is where it was more human error. So somebody clicked on something or somebody typed in their password to something or, just human error. So, a good third of these incidences just in 2020 were from just human error. A few, intentional attacks. And then this one is other. I'm not sure what the other is comprised of, but this is really interesting. So this is an interactive map. This is just a screenshot of it, but you can go to the K-12 cyber incident map. It's super interesting and they keep it updated. So you can hover over any of these things, and it'll tell you where it happened and what kind of cyber incident it was, if it was like a ransomware attack, or, I mean, let's face it, a lot of these, I was doing it earlier, a lot of these are that Pearson hack, because they were such a huge vendor that had this hack, but pretty interesting. So it's happening everywhere to schools. And one of the reasons why schools are so attractive is because if hackers can get, and they can get student data is like gold, because students have clean credit records for the most part, and they can sell student data with these clean credit records on the dark web, and it's a whole thing. Not that every attack is for that purpose, but it's just kind of interesting to think, well, like, why schools? It's not like we have money really, but part of it is just to get that student data. All right, privacy, ethics, and equity concerns. And so ethics and equity are a little bit different. Ethics, or think about it, it's guiding principles for how we should govern, use, and protect data. Examples like what we can collect, how long should we store it, who can access it, and why are we using it? So districts have to have policies that distinguish appropriate and inappropriate data practices, and also communicate those practices. And I think a lot of districts, we're not so great at that. It's more like, this is kind of how we always do things, and if someone needs to get them, we'll get the data to them, but there's not always like a really distinctive policy per se, like there should be. Data equity, on the other hand, this is thinking about using data to understand systemic, structural, educational barriers to student success, and then trying to improve those barriers and structures. So equitable data practices include audits of data systems, and data practices, just to ensure we're not having any bias and discrimination. Identifying and addressing achievement, resource, and opportunity gaps. And then communicating with students and families, talk about the ethical and responsible use of their data, which is partly what SOPA was trying to get to, like saying, let's be transparent with our families and tell them what data is being collected. And so, just if you're interested, these are in my resources. There are two really good data principle statements that I thought were worth just noting. I'm not going to go through these at all, but this one is from COSIN and the Data Quality Campaign. And it's just a series of 10 statements about, it's got mostly data ethics, a little bit of data equity. So, what are the most important things about using data ethically and how to do that? This one I loved. This, it's really more about equity, so data equity. And so the signatories of this included education people, privacy people, disability rights, civil rights organizations are all the signatories. And this is talking about how to use student data in an equitable way. So I think these two principal statements can be used in conjunction and can be worth sharing, if your school district is interested in trying to have a conversation about data ethics and equity. Okay, so here is a time for a little bit of interactivity. So modern dilemma. There's a lot of modern dilemmas out there when it comes to student data privacy. So one of them is student monitoring. And student monitoring, by that, I mean specifically modern tools and sites that can look out for potentially self-harm talk or anything that students might generate that indicates potential for self-harm, violence, drugs, anything like that. So there are several companies that do this. There's Gaggle, there's, I think, Opera has one maybe, and there's a few others out there. And so when we look at this graphic, what types of student data are monitored for that kind of information? Yeah, thank you, Chris. Securely, yeah. School Guardian, thank you. These all have that kind of, that's like one of their modules that you can purchase. Spark, yep. And so school issued devices can be monitored for this kind of information. stuff that's happening on the school's internet. And then, of course, any school apps and accounts. So Gaggle looks specifically at Google stuff. Some of the others have a little bit wider of a range, but school apps and accounts. And so why do schools monitor for this kind of thing? Number one, we care about students, and we really, really care about student safety. And that's, the number one thing that I think most schools would say, looking to avoid violence, bullying, or intention to self-harm. Another, possibly compliance, to make sure that students are not accessing, information and sites that they should not be accessing by kind of increasing this level of monitoring. And then also to address community concerns and to be able to say to the school board or to the community, we care so much about student safety and compliance that we are taking this extra step, and we're going to be, monitoring for self-harm and violence and bullying and things like that. So how could student data be used? The system analyzes the student data for keywords, keywords about self-harm, violence, bullying, etc., things like that. And so basically the system, most of these, the system flags the stuff, and then usually, depending on the level of severity, potential severity, it gets kicked up to a human reviewer. So then a human reviewer looks at it, and then depending on that, action might be taken. So a warning might be sent to the student, content might be blocked, and if there's something about potential self-harm, violence, that kind of thing, school staff might be alerted. Okay, so that's student monitoring. Good intentions for sure, student safety. But what I want to know from you guys is what thoughts come to your mind talking about student data privacy and all of the stuff that we've been talking about so far. What could some potential issues be with student monitoring software? And if you want to just throw some ideas in the chat, just anything that comes to your mind that might be potentially make you pause, or at least have a really serious conversation with your school or district. And just make sure your chat is changed to everyone. And I will wait. I do have the next slide, the Student Privacy Compass, they put out a blog recently addressing this issue. And so the next slide talks about, well, what are some of these concerns? But it's just interesting because, like, in a previous district, we had this, and it never crossed my mind that there might be any issues with it. Balance between invasion of privacy and student monitoring. Yes, yeah, staff responsibility when a safety concern is shared. Email alerts get sent to the wrong people. These issues belong to everyone at a district, yeah. Okay, I'm going to click to the next slide so you can see what the Student Privacy Compass said. So students could be mistakenly flagged. Depending on why they're typing whatever they're typing, they could have a false negative flag that was a mistake. Students could be potentially unfairly treated depending on how this information is flagged or shared. Yes, Micah. So sometimes those software initiates an intervention with social workers or police. That's one of the things that is mentioned here in this slide. So students being subjected to excess scrutiny, students having mental health details inappropriately disclosed. So that's where it's like, who is privy to this information? How are we sharing this information? Students needlessly being put in contact with law enforcement, social services, school disciplinarians. Students having sensitive personal information shared, and then also students experiencing a chilling effect. So, we do want our students to have access to the information they need And if there's a real concern and fear and feeling that everything that the student looks up or does online is going to be like heavily scrutinized and might have some really serious consequences, students might be more reluctant to use these devices for things that we want them to use them for. It's a balancing act. But I think if you are considering having some of this software, these are issues that do need to be addressed for sure. Other modern dilemmas, biometrics. So this was a New York Times article about a school district in New York a few years ago that adopted facial recognition software so that they could more easily know who's on campus, where, which buildings they were at, when. And so it just kind of like happened. And then a parent got wind of it and got really upset, and then eventually kind of brought a lawsuit. And so that resulted in New York issuing the first in the nation, this has not happened before, moratorium on facial recognition in schools. So it wasn't saying you can never do this, but it was recognizing we don't know enough about the implications of this. Let's put a pause on it, go and do some research, New York public schools, and then come back to us and let us know what you found. So that, I think that was a great way for them to handle it, because a lot of this stuff is so new and privacy implications really do need to be considered. Another one is voice assistance in the classroom. So this is just a screenshot of a tweet that was like, hey, use your Alexa in the classroom. But here's a blog from the Student Privacy Compass where they talk about, is that okay? What are some privacy implications of having a Google Voice or an Alexa in your classroom? So again, like, these things aren't like wrong, like black and white wrong. It's more like they're gray. You need to think about it and come up with what are we willing to do and what kinds of privacy are we willing to potentially compromise. Okay, this is my favorite part of this presentation. So we have a few scenarios here. And so again, if you want to answer or put your thoughts in the chat, please do. So scenario number one, breach of app used by students. So there's this basketball team, and Coach Kittles wants to keep his basketball players engaged during the off season. So he has each athlete down this home court app on their phones so they can work on their dribbling skills in a video game format. Players set up their phone camera so they can see themselves, and the app shoots video of them responding to movement and dribbling cues. Players are excited, they compete with each other online, push each other to improve their skills. One day, Coach Kittles and all the players receive a notification from the app that some personal data was stolen via a breach. So what things does that bring to mind? Like, what questions might you have if this was your school, or like if you're a principal and this teacher came to you and was like, there's a data breach, or if you're the technology person. So, okay, Chris says, did the school know it was being used? That's a great question. Was the app approved? Mm-hmm. And so there's, on the slide here, there's some additional kind of questions for consideration. So would the scenario change if it was approved by the athletic department or the school district? And then also, what responsibilities does the coach have? Yeah, SOPA, is there a SOPA agreement with this app? How would you know there was a breach? And so what do you think the coach should do? So you're the coach, you find out that there's been a security breach. Like, who do you tell? Resign. God. Well, hopefully, yeah, I mean, hopefully nothing happened with all of that data, but we can't be confident about that. But that is a question. Like, does the coach just send an email to the parents? That's a question. Is that the first thing he should do? Is contact the parents? Superintendent, maybe, yeah. Because you got to think, like, who needs to know if this is going to blow up and be a huge thing? Who really needs to know first? And maybe is there like a notification plan? So probably the superintendent, maybe the CTO. they can, yeah, notify the direct supervisor, and then they can determine what's the plan and how are we contacting the parents, community, potentially. Maybe then it'll generate kind of like an all staff email or some sort of reminder, like we have to, lawyer, yep, counsel, we have to make sure staff understands the process for this stuff. All right, I'm going to go to the next scenario. Oh, so I'm not going to go through this, but this is the student privacy compass, their response to that. So at your leisure, I'll make sure to open the permissions for that slideshow, but they have some really interesting, thoughtful ways of responding to each of these scenarios. So this is what I was talking about earlier. Administering social emotional well-being student surveys. Ms. Wang is concerned about how her students are coping with the rapid transition to online learning and in light of other major current events. She decides to learn about her students' social emotional well-being by sending out individual student surveys to them. So what questions do you have about that? And so what steps should she take in administering this survey? What are some things, maybe laws she should consider, or people who should she talk to about it? Yeah, nothing too personal. Maybe waivers, potentially. Yeah, Mike, I agree. Share with principal first, just to kind of make sure it's okay, especially depending on how deep you go in this survey, and then contact parents for permission. Answered anonymously. Yeah, what are the expectations and what will be done with the info, for sure. Okay, go to the next one. And so again, there's some good reflection about that question. This one here, this is that PPRA, which is the law about the 8 protected topics that you can't ask students about without parental permission. But I would say for sure, talk to the principal first before administering any kind of survey that might potentially have any kind of sensitive questions in it, just to make sure the principal knows, in case they get any parent, phone calls or emails. Okay. Diagnostic. So Mrs. Ginny is an experienced teacher. She's been working with one student, Randy, is concerned about his reading skills. Based on her experience and her observations, Miss Ginny strongly suspects that Randy has dyslexia. Miss Ginny lacks definitive evidence of a diagnosis and wants to get a formal diagnosis, but she doesn't know who she can share Randy's information with. And she's concerned that in asking for help, she may improperly disclose information about Randy. So this, like if you go back and think about FERPA, which says parents have to give permission to share student information, except for professionals with like a vested educational interest in that specific student and that issue. So what should she do? Or what should you do if you're a teacher and you're like, I've got concerns about this kid, I've got some information, but who can I like legally share that information with? Or who should she ask? Who would know? Yeah, maybe the special ed director. Request a team meeting. So the next slide on this one as well. So I thought this was a really interesting example just because this happens a lot, I would say, is like we have concerns about kids. We talk about kids together all the time. So like what things do we need to be thinking about when we talk about students? Yeah. So in this slideshow, Vince, I'm seeing this. There's a lot of resources at the last couple of slides. Also, some of all of this stuff in the slideshow, I think could be helpful to answer the question. Also, the student privacy compass, that's the nonprofit org that is really full of information, FAQs and things like that, that has some great kind of documents, brief documents for schools to consider. All right, I'm going to skip this last scenario, but student data privacy advocacy. So what can we actually do about this depending on our role? So first of all, we can check ourselves, we can teach our students, be transparent with parents, and educate our staff. So check yourself. Passwords, make sure you have good passwords. Passphrases, turns out, are the most secure of all kinds of passwords you can have. So like a passphrase, you can Google that, what is that? How long should it be? Passphrases are great. Just one thing we, as no matter what our role is, can do to help protect student data. Pay attention to privacy policies and terms of service. No FERPA, especially, but also SOPA. Learn your district policies about this stuff. Or if you're the person, the district, you can make sure people know what your policies are and what the requirements are. When in doubt, if you're not sure about something, ask your principal, or if you're a principal, ask your cabinet members, your CTO, your director of tech. Any of these people will be able to point you in the right direction. Teach your students. These are my two favorite student kind of digital citizenship data privacy things. I especially love Common Sense because they have curriculum already written, lessons K through 12. And each little band, so each grade level has all of these topics. And so you can see each grade level has at least 1 or 2 lessons about privacy and security. So that, I think, is one thing that you can absolutely do. Everything's made for you, great resources, stuff you can share with parents then after the lessons. Really, really excellent. Google's Be Internet Awesome also has some lands which are more about data privacy and security. So that's a really great thing to do as well. Be transparent with parents. SOPA, as you know, requires all of this stuff to be listed on the district website. Parents have to be notified annually. Also, if there's a data breach that involves over 10% of the student body, parents have to be informed. If you're a teacher, I suggest informing parents about what platforms you're using and why. Just could be something you do at the beginning of the year. Just here's a list of things that we'll be using and what they each do, because I think that sometimes goes a long way to make parents feel better, like you know what you're doing and that you're sharing that and being transparent with parents. And just another note, these laws do not allow parents to opt out. So that is one thing that I think makes it easier to be transparent. And then educate your staff. So if you are in any way, shape, or form like a tech coordinator or coach or principal or anybody like that, talk about student data privacy with your colleagues. Or if you're a teacher and you meet with your team, you know some stuff now that maybe you can share if things come up that you can help kind of create this culture of student data privacy. Ask lots of questions. Encourage your IT department maybe to do phishing awareness campaigns, which are really great. It kind of helps people practice not clicking on things without kind of knowing what to look for and making sure that stuff is coming from reliable sources. Staff trainings. If you're in an administrative position, consider requiring multi-factor authentication for certain people at certain levels. That just requires them to log in on their phone or enter a code or something, but just like another level of security just for people who have a lot of access. And so that's it. So these are just a couple of pages of just linked resources that I used for this presentation. Please be a student data privacy warrior. Thank you guys all for coming. And I'm going to stay on the line for the next several minutes. So if anybody has questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat, or Arlen, they can unmute themselves as well.
Yeah, that's right. If you'd like to ask Alicia a question verbally, feel free to raise your hand and I will enable you to turn on your microphone. But you've also got the chat at your disposal as well for asking any follow-up questions. Alicia, thank you so much for sharing this wonderful information.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. See, it's interesting. Student data privacy. Who knew?
Exactly.
Thanks,
yeah, it sounds like it's going to be boring, but you made it interesting. Looked like, let's see if I can find it here. Vince had a question about a 1 to 2 page document sharing the key points. Maybe the PowerPoint would be good for Vince to have access to, so they can share with attendance officer.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, and somebody mentioned that it was not shared, which I guess Canva,
right.
I did not realize that. So let me.
Yeah, there's some privilege you'll have to enable.
Share. All right, share link to view, I guess. Copy link. Okay, I'm just going to put that in the chat.
Yeah, paste that right into chat. That way everybody can have access to your PowerPoint. Okay. That's always a big request as well. There it is.
Yeah, and that bit.ly should be live or should be shareable. So I'll just kind of look at that after this is over.
Okay, the new link is working for me, so that is great.
Okay, good.
But yeah, we've got a couple more minutes. So anybody want to raise their hand or type into the chat? Looks like Daniel's got a question.
Testing is made to look like it came from the IT department. Yes, it was phishing. I reported it in IT to get involved. Yeah, that's right. It is real and it is sneaky. One of the things that for some reason happens in schools is people get requests that look like they're from the principal asking for like gift cards. So I don't know, last year sometime we had a school secretary receive an email from what she thought was that school's principal asking her to get like $300 worth of gift cards. And so she went to a few different locations and bought all these gift cards. And of course it was a scam. So, you know, she lost $300. It is real and it is very sneaky. And so these phishing campaigns can be great because they can make it look like that kind of thing. And then if people click on it, the IT department can see who clicked on what, if people actually entered information. And it's not to kind of be like a gotcha thing. It's more like, I think if you do something like that, you can then get something sent to you that's like, okay, because of, you know, this, watch this little video and make sure like these are the things that are clues if you're not sure about something. And since we started doing those phishing campaigns, now we tend to get a lot of people sending us stuff saying, is this okay? And sometimes it is okay. But that's much more preferable to people just like clicking on anything.
And just a comment here as we wrap up, we have this recording. We'll have it made available tomorrow to everybody who registered and attended. I will also be sending an evaluation form, a link online so you can complete an evaluation. And for those in Illinois, get your ISB evidence of completion form, and you'll get 1 professional development clock hour for attending Alicia's presentation. All right, I don't see any hands up and I don't see any more in chat, so I'm going to stop the recording. And Alicia, thank you so much once again for this awesome presentation on student data privacy.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.